Wall Street Week with host Louis Rukeyser provides the latest news in the world of business and finance. Rukeyser, the Wizard of Wall Street, with top financial analyst guests, helps viewers make the most of their money with his sound financial advice and transforms the complex business of business into a comprehensible and entertaining topic. Wall Street Week with Louis Rukeyser, Fridays at 9:30 on Channel 17. Monday, it's American Masters. Explore the creative genius of some of America's most talented artists, architects, musicians, and writers as they are profiled each week on American Masters, Monday night at 10. Monday, join host Laurie Anderson for A Live from Off-Center. Explore the latest in video art from around the world, including drama, dance, music, and comedy. It's art's latest art form, A Live from Off-Center, Monday night at 11. Tuesday, it's Evening at Pops. Join the Boston Pops and their many talented guests for an hour of music and memories. It's Evening at Pops, Tuesday nights at 9. Thursday, Tony Brown's Journal presents hard-hitting public affairs documentaries and interviews of special interest to the black community. Veteran journalist Tony Brown combines a sensitivity for the concerns of black Americans with his unique and engaging style. See Tony Brown's Journal, Thursday night at 9:30 here on Channel 17. Thursday, when William F. Buckley, Jr. and his guests square off for Firing Line. The weapons they choose are ideas. Emmy Award-winning Firing Line has welcomed political views of every side. Watch Firing Line Thursday night at 10. This week on Mystery, gather the clues along with Sherlock Holmes. This is your... Almanac is a production of KTCA TV for stations of the Minnesota Public Television Association.
It was the biggest and almost the only story this week, the Northwest plane crash. Tonight, we'll look at how well the Twin Cities media reported the disaster with the help of our media panel. Good evening. I'm Jan Smaby. Also tonight, Eric Escala and I will try to sort out this week's confusing stories about AIDS, and then we'll discover why a New York ad agency thinks the Twin Cities area is the most normal place in all of America. Now, it's not even nice outside, so get back in that chair and stay with us for Almanac.
Funding for Almanac is provided by Larkin Hoffman Daly & Lindgren Limited, attorneys at law with offices in Bloomington and Minneapolis. Norstan Incorporated, a distributor for telecommunications equipment products including IBM Roll. Minnesota's credit unions, people helping people. And Gabbert's Furniture and Design Studio of Edina. You'll find your home at Gabbert's.
And you think you've got it bad. What about Mark Tucker and his epic treehouse battle with the sinister government of St. Louis Park? Read about this. Tucker has a multi-level $7,000 treehouse in his backyard, and the St. Louis Park City Council voted this week to give him 20 days to bring the house up to code or get rid of it. Tucker was just about to make the improvements when he got his treehouse renter's credit refund in the mail, and just like everybody else, it was cut 33% by the state. Tucker now says he'll move his treehouse to South Dakota, where he'll rent out the dwelling to homesick Minnesota business operators. Physical fitness tip this week from Harvard University. Now, if you don't like to jog, you might want to try the Groucho walk. The low-slung, half-walk, half-run, made popular by Groucho Marx, said to be good exercise because it takes 50% more energy than regular running does. It's also easier on your back and your leg joints. The study didn't take into account the health impact of wearing a grease-paint mustache, waggling a cigar, leering at a beautiful woman, or rolling your eyes. I'm going to work on that impression. Eleanor Mondale, the smart and sassy daughter of Fighting Fritz, is back in the political spotlight, signing on to manage the presidential campaign of, yes, Morris the Cat. Eleanor denies that this is a cheap publicity stunt to sell cat food. She says she hooked up with Morris reluctantly, only after finding out that Governor Perpich really is running for Premier of Alberta. Morris defended his selection, saying that after the last 2 presidential campaigns, he figures the Mondale family has 7 lives left. Hennepin County is trying to spice up its marriage license certificates after many newlyweds complained that it's only a small carbon copy that looks like a check. So, in an effort to add some romance, the new Hennepin County marriage license will carry this little poem. In the county of Hennepin, you are about to be wed. The gifts will be given, the prayers will be said. You'll both say I do to your partner for life, and say you'll be faithful through sickness and strife. But before the best wishes, congrats and good lucks, please pay for the license, and it'll be $45.
Here's a rundown of some Minnesota headlines this week. Let's start with the obvious. Sunday night, a Northwest airliner crashed on takeoff near Detroit. There was 1 survivor among the 153 passengers. The Northwest story dominated local media this week, and the quality of that media coverage will be one of our topics later tonight. In other stories, on Tuesday, Minnesota striker officials announced that they expect to raise enough money to field an indoor soccer season next year. And on Thursday, Viking Tommy Kramer pleaded not guilty to a charge of drunk driving. And late on Thursday, a federal judge barred Minnesota's new fetal disposal law from taking effect, the judge ruling that the law is too vague. But our first topic tonight is actually a collection of stories. This past week, there have been a number of reports about AIDS that, well, frankly, have us scratching our heads. It began last Saturday when a front-page newspaper article suggested that the much-heralded heterosexual spread of AIDS may not happen after all. Later in the week, there were several other AIDS-related articles that raised questions, stories about virus incubation periods and vaccine testing. Well, we thought it might be helpful to get an update on these developments from state epidemiologist Michael Osterholm. Welcome back, Mike.
Thank you.
Centers for Disease Control, or at least officials thereof, seem to be saying this past week that there is very little crossover of AIDS into the heterosexual population, and that the threat to heterosexuals has been greatly exaggerated. Do you agree?
Well, I think it's that relative point of what's greatly exaggerated. One of the problems we're having is that different news media sources report out different stories in such a way as to be appear to be in conflict when in fact they're not. We have said all along that AIDS will not be a disease that will sweep through the majority of the heterosexual population in Minnesota. For example, in the last year, we've tested almost 250,000 Minnesota blood donors and have yet to find a positive heterosexual among that group that did not know that they were infected. On the other hand, we have an increasing number of individuals who are heterosexuals with a frequent number of sex partners, 10, 20, or 30 a year. They are a heterosexual sex partner of an IV drug user or a bisexual man where they are developing AIDS. So in fact, it's not to say that it won't be a problem. What we're saying is it won't be a problem for the vast majority of heterosexuals in this country.
And the article went on to say, I think it quoted what they called local health officials as saying that with the Minnesota Midwest lifestyle that it wasn't going to be a big problem here.
Right, and I think the thing to really emphasize is this is not new. In other words, this story was not new news to anyone that has been working with AIDS. All we're saying is that the same kind of problem that has occurred in gay and bisexual men and among heterosexual sex partners of high-risk individuals or those who have many partners, 20 or 30 a year, yes, that's going to be a problem. In this country, AIDS in heterosexuals remains largely a problem, as we talked in this same program several weeks ago, among our minorities. 75% of the cases of AIDS in this country right now occurring among heterosexuals are occurring among blacks. Many of them are heterosexual sex partners of IV drug users or individuals who are having multiple partners.
What about the vaccine? That seems to be maybe the more long-term question, and there's some talk that there's been some progress made.
Well, in fact, the vaccine progress, again, is nothing new. What this was a very routine kind of application that a company made to even begin to put a type of vaccine into humans just for purposes of safety testing. We are still many, many years off. I would add that the same vaccine that is going to be used in humans has initially been put into chimpanzees and was not effective. So in effect, these studies really are just early studies to look at safety issues. What is it that you can put into humans before you start seeing serious reactions that would actually prevent you from ever using that as a vaccine?
Did the stories generate some calls to your office? Or?
I think many calls, and again, it appeared to be new news, and in fact it wasn't. This is something that was long expected, and you're going to see a number of new applications to the FDA in the near future. Many times from the time that an application like this is made, and I think with this vaccine being as difficult as it is going to be to produce, an immune response in the body that will fight off the virus. But even in less complicated issues, it often is many years from the time that this type of application is filed and the ultimate vaccine hits the market.
Michael, what about the incubation period? A report came out this year that this week that it could be as long as 9 years, the incubation of the virus. Is that correct?
It is, and again, nothing new. In fact, on this very program, we have said time and time again that once you are infected with this virus, you are basically walking around with this as a time bomb within your body. Early on, people wanted to believe that only 5 or 10 or maybe 15% of people who were infected would ultimately develop the infection or develop the disease. Because of the fact that we've only had about 7 to 8 years in this country's experience with this virus, it was hard for us to know just how many ultimately would go on. But we've been saying for a long time that probably most people who are infected with this virus will ultimately, over a 10 to 15-year period, succumb to its serious illnesses. All this particular study did was reaffirm that. As we get farther down the road, we're seeing more people develop serious complications of this infection.
Mike, you've been one of the leading spokespersons on AIDS for the past couple of years. Would you change anything you've been saying to the general public based on any of these reports that were issued this week?
None. In fact, I would refer you all back to 1984 and 85 news stories that came out, and every one of the things that came out this week we said back in 84 and 85. So that puts it into perspective of is it new.
All right. Mike Osterholm, thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Well, believe it or not, there are people out there who have had it up to with Garrison Keillor. But it was announced today that an unauthorized biography of the great Shy One is about to hit the nation's bookstores. The author is a Minnesotan who now lives in Gary Keillor's hometown of Anoka. And writer Michael Fido joins us. Nice to have you here. Just one of these tell-all biographies where you're going to rip the lid off this Minnesota icon and just have everything right on the supermarket shelf for people to buy? Or?
Well, as much as possible, yes. He is kind of a Horatio Alger story for the 80s, but on the other hand, there's a little dark side to him too.
And how dark is it? That's what we want to get to, the kind of the juice here, I think.
Well, I don't want to reveal.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, tease us.
That's all in the book.
Well, move some units here with a teaser. What kind of juice you got?
Well, he masks a lot of that darkness with this marvelous voice, and a lot of academicians and scholars, broadcasting scholars who've looked at this have said that this is a man who has a dark, dark humor. And you'll read all about it in the book.
She's not going to give anything away.
We've got to do a little better than this.
This is making me just shudder. But this is an unauthorized biography of Garrison Keillor, which seems terribly presumptuous of you, given his declaration all these years that he is such a shy man. But nonetheless, who were your most interesting sources for this biography?
Well, there were lots of sources, quite a number, in fact. Old high school teachers, classmates from elementary school on up, people who had worked with him over the years. So there were really quite a few sources. And by the way, I probably should also say that unauthorized as a biography is not necessarily a pejorative. In this sense, it was just that he did not wish to cooperate, and in that case, it's an unauthorized biography.
Although I thought that his lawyers have communicated with you or the publisher in some way which would not necessarily be encouraging to the publication of this book.
Well,
you get right to the heart of it.
Sure, it may have been an attempt at intimidation, yes, but no threat in the sense that a public person's privacy is not the same as the privacy of ordinary private citizens.
Maybe take a look at what the cover's going to look like in the bookstores right around Christmas time.
It'll be a Christmas book.
Okay, well, that makes sense. What will the reader be most surprised about? What area of his life or career, whatever, will they be surprised about?
Well, perhaps his disciples may not be terribly surprised about a whole lot of things, but there are, I think, a number of elements in there that are unique and interesting about his background. Here's a man who came out of a fundamentalist religion, a very narrow one, a small group of people, perhaps less than 100,000 in the United States and Canada combined, and he rose from that to reach an audience of more than 4 million people. I think that that's a rather remarkable thing.
How's his staying power going to be? He's in Denmark, out of sight, out of mind with this guy, or is he going to be with us?
I think that he will be back, and I think that he will be back because he works a live audience. Now, people who have been in show business who have that live audience, there's a real rush from a live audience that gives you more than anything else. Nothing else can compare with that.
So why did he leave?
I think it was time for this aspect of his life and career to end, and that's why I think he left this. I think that he will have a hard time staying away simply because he gets that rush from a live audience. I think it also sells his books. His volume of short stories, for instance, which sold about 200,000 copies. A lot of New York publishing insiders said that without the program, without him being who he was, would have been lucky to sell 15,000 copies of that book. Short story volumes simply don't sell well.
The Man from Lake Wobegon. Michael Fido's the author, available $16.95, Morrow Press, at Christmas time.
Not Morrow, that's St. Martin's.
St. Martin's. I thought I was going to be like Johnny Carson. Oh, well. Thanks a lot. Nice to have you here. Thank you.
Each year, the State Tourism Department and area chambers of commerce spend millions of dollars to prove to outsiders that the Twin Cities area isn't your run-of-the-mill big town. They spend money on media blitzes trying to convince folks that somehow we're different. Well, despite all that, a New York ad agency this week announced to the world that the Twin Cities metro area is the most average place in the entire United States. The proof? Last year, more new products were test marketed in the Twin Cities than in any other place in the country. Now, why is that the case? Well, Howard List might have the answer. He's with the Campbell and Methuen Ad Agency, a sister organization to Saatchi Saatchi?
Arigato.
The group that made this week's announcement. Howard List, we're just coming off an interview about an unauthorized biography of Garrison Keillor, who kept telling us for over a decade that the children in Lake Wobegon were above average, and then you all come along and say, hey, you're just average. I'm not average.
Well, I don't know. You're kind
He
of average.
certainly isn't.
Thanks a lot.
Well,
What is it about us
Why are we so
that
good
we
at
fall
testing?
into that
why are we
market?
so good at testing? I think the reason that the Twin Cities is used as a common test market is because age, income, other demographic factors that are in the Twin Cities are a fairly reasonable mirror of a national average. And so for that reason, we get used a lot. I also think the Twin Cities is used a lot because it's a reasonably isolated market. When you buy media in the Twin Cities, you're just covering the Minneapolis, St. Paul metropolitan area. And the same is true when you're selling to retailers, department stores, or drugstores, food stores. And the spill in or spill out, as it is referred to, is minimized in this area.
Now, by the way, in terms of our population demographics,
Right.
we have a lower percentage of non-whites in our population than certainly other major metropolitan areas. Would that affect the results of the marketing here?
If anybody was developing a new product that would be aimed at a minority like Hispanics or blacks, I think those two demographic segments total about only 5% of the Twin Cities population, where they're closer to about 16% on the national average. So you'd be unlikely to choose the Twin Cities for test marketing a product that would be skewed toward those groups.
How does this work? Some big company's wants to test a new product, and How do they do that? They just sell a bunch at the supermarket to anybody who wants to buy it, or what's the process? How does it work?
How do you sell a product?
How does testing work? How do you go about testing a product in this market?
Normally, you'd sell this into Minneapolis, St. Paul area the way you would any other market. The only difference would primarily be in the way that you research the marketplace to try to get an understanding for what kind of percentage of trial that you had in the market on this new product, what kind of repeat purchasing patterns resulted from this, and then using market research and statistics, trying to project what kind of local volume and then national volume would result.
Okay, so now let's get down to the nitty-gritty. What do we like and what don't we like? What's worked here?
Well, I think probably one of the biggest national success that I can think of that was originally tested here was Procter & Gamble's Pampers diapers, the disposable diapers.
That's something I'm proud of. I mean, that's terrific.
They weren't even intending the product for you.
Well, I got some peripheral use. Does it benefit us? Does the Twin Cities get any peripheral benefit out of this? I mean, other than, we can kind of say we're a test market. Do we get anything?
I think from an economic standpoint, it would certainly benefit the media. The television stations, the radio stations, the newspapers would certainly benefit from that. Also, there's an important market research community here in the Twin Cities that would benefit. They'd be hired by companies to conduct research in the Twin Cities.
Would consumers be shocked by the amount of research and data that's generated for products? I mean, you just don't put it on the shelf and hope it sells.
I think they'd be surprised, unquestionably so.
Yeah.
All right, so we're big on Pampers, or we proved that was maybe going to be a hot item. Anything else, and has anything really bombed here?
Oh, I think many things have bombed here, but I think we're not necessarily big on things. In fact, one of the reasons we're chosen is because we're more average on things. If you looked at categories like pizzas or shampoos or cereals or snacks, the consumption per thousand in this city is probably more representative. Obviously, we're unrepresentative of lots of product categories like suntan oils or roach killers or products that for geographic reasons wouldn't do as well here.
Not in my apartment.
Howard, do you feel average?
No, and I'm told every day that I have no reason to feel average.
I'm glad to hear that. Howard List, thank you for joining us.
It was said to be the first human rights ordinance in Minnesota. 20 years ago this month, the Minneapolis City Council approved the creation of that city's Civil Rights Commission. And in the upcoming weeks, Minneapolis officials will be celebrating what continues to be an important and controversial part of city government. With us now to talk about the past 2 decades of civil rights in Minneapolis, Mary Emma Hickson, who is the current director of the city's Civil Rights Department. Bill Davis chairs the Minneapolis Civil Rights Commission. And here, too, is Harry Davis, longtime civil rights leader in Minneapolis, charter member of the Civil Rights Commission back in 1967. Thanks all for being here. Harry Davis, start with you.
Yes.
The atmosphere of 67 and maybe the genesis of the ordinance and how things changed.
Well, if you look at 67, we just completed a riot in North Minneapolis in 66, and there was a repeat in 67 along Plymouth Avenue. Mayor Naftalin's Mayor's Commission on Civil Rights was not a legitimate organization. It did not have full power of ordinance or legislature. At that time, I was on the Fair Employment Practice Commission along with Leonard Lindquist, and Mayor Naftalin appointed a committee made up of Leonard Lindquist, Gary Flackney, Stanley King, Frank Alsep, and myself, along with 2 other attorneys to draft a civil rights ordinance.
Was it tough to do?
No, it wasn't, because we had the 1964 Civil Rights Legislature from the federal government to pattern it after, and we had the Mayor's Commission on Civil Rights for a number of years, so it was not too hard to pattern.
Did it calm things down?
Well, actually, what it did is it opened up public accommodation, public housing, restaurants and hotels and work opportunities and things of that sort.
How bad were we still into the early and mid-60s in terms of being closed
Well, if
in
you
our
figure that the
accommodation?
federal civil rights law was passed in '64, and the bill was headed by Hubert Humphrey from the state of Minnesota, from the city of Minneapolis, the former mayor. We were 3 years behind the rest of the country, and usually in civil rights we're 20 years ahead, but we were behind at that time. But you have to look too at the real acts of discrimination were broken down in 1946 when Hubert Humphrey was mayor. As a child in North Minneapolis, you couldn't eat at the downtown restaurants, you couldn't stay at the downtown hotels. You could work there, but there were no black teachers in the public schools, not even black janitors.
Let me get Bill Davis in.
Sure.
Move ahead now to your, what, 7 years on the board?
7 years on, actually 8, yeah.
You hear some grumbling once in a while that the ordinance and the discrimination cases are moving away from protection of minorities to gender issues, age issues. Are you seeing that? Do you share that concern that the minorities are not getting the full protection and treatment by the department?
Well, I think when we broaden the ordinance and expand its scope, that doesn't diminish any particular group's protection. What it does is says that there's more people that are actually being discriminated or being treated differently. And the ordinance, what in essence it becomes is more comprehensive. And I think that that's one of the things we should point out is that Minneapolis ordinance, not only being one of the oldest, but certainly is one of the most comprehensive civil rights ordinances in the country.
I mean, Sexton, you came from, what, Missouri? A little controversy in your appointment, a white woman heading the department. What's your philosophy of the department, and have you seen it evolve over your time?
Well, I don't think I've changed anything dramatically. What I've tried to do is to get the department's presence out into the community as much as possible. And that's part of what we're doing with this 20th anniversary program, a lot of positive educational things so that people can learn more about civil rights issues, learn more about the different groups in the community. Ending ignorance is a big focus that we're about. I think there's still lots of ignorance on the part of the white majority.
Well, tell us about that. How bad is it? Do you think things would be pretty good in Minneapolis in 1987?
Well, everything's relative, I guess.
Yeah.
There are still lots of problems. You can still go into companies in town that have virtually no black employees, as an example. That still happens. There's some systematic discrimination, and then there are lots of isolated situations that take place between individuals, unfortunately one of whom is in a position of power over the other. There's still lots of discrimination. We, as I say, are trying to focus on preventative as well as going out after the perpetrators. We're also doing preventative work with educational programs and efforts like this. And I hope we're going to talk about the upcoming events for our 20th anniversary.
We will, but we're
Okay,
going to say
good.
that. Harry Davis, could there have been a feminist movement, a gay liberation movement, even the Grey Panther movement, had there not been the civil rights movement of the 60s, which was principally aimed toward blacks in the United States?
Well, I think the country was moving towards kind of an explosion point. And of course, at that time, in the area of civil rights and riots and so forth, the blacks were in the forefront. And so actually with the black ministerial leadership group, they took the leadership and others filled in. But the vast majority of the civil rights movement, the marches, the demonstration, the lobbying for the legislature and so forth was done by the black movement.
How sensitive and aware, to really all three of you, but let me come back to you, Harry, how sensitive and aware do you think the generations that have come since the 1960s are to civil rights?
Well, if you look at administrations, I don't, not to talk about political parties, but this administration under Reagan has not done the civil rights movement any good. It has broken down a number of them, the laws and protections, and so the movement itself is not as open and as focusing on those things as it has been in the past. So the younger generation in many cases are not as aware of it as it used to be.
Is that a problem, Bill, sort of us, in that we haven't taught our children? I mean, do you sense that the children of the 60s have not taught their children sufficiently about civil rights of all people?
Well, I think that there's a combination of factors that play into that. Certainly that's part of it, but I also think that lacking and not having the hands-on experience of seeing it televised on TV. I think they hear about it in school and it becomes part of a lesson plan as opposed to an actual hands-on experience. And I think that what we also are observing in today's civil rights area is a more sophisticated form of discrimination, whereas before it may have been a little more blatant, a little more upfront. Now it's a little more subtle, it's a little more sophisticated, and we too, as civil rights advocates and civil rights enforcers, have to become more sophisticated in terms of our approach. And we see education, ongoing education in this field, is a very vital tool in a way of mitigating some of the problems that we experienced in the past.
Give us a rundown of your events.
Well, our slogan for this celebration is "We'll Never Turn Back," which I think has a lot to do with Mr. Davis saying about the Reagan administration, that we're not going to go backwards with this. We're recreating a 60s event. We're having a sit-in, commemorative sit-in this Tuesday afternoon at noon at the Hennepin County Government Center out front there, weather permitting. And we will have a number of speakers, most notably Dr. Mary Frances Berry, who is one of the pre-Reagan survivors on the United States Commission on Civil Rights. She has managed to stay in there and keep the faith. She's a noted constitutional historian and a dynamic speaker, so she will be the keynote speaker. We have speakers from many of the different communities that make up our diverse city, and it should be a fascinating program. And so people who weren't there, they were too young or they were too scared, this is their big opportunity now. You could come and it'll be a little bit different atmosphere, won't it, Mr. Davis?
Yeah, that's great. Well, we have to end it there. A real reason to celebrate, though, and congratulations to all of you. Good luck with it. Thank you. Thanks for being here tonight.
Well, 51 years ago this week, Minnesota Governor Floyd B. Olson died at the age of 44. And there are folks in Minnesota who still get sad when they think of that time. Over the past 50 years, Floyd Bjornstern Olson has become the stuff of legend. He's also become the subject of tonight's mini history lesson with Hi Berman. Hello, Hi.
Hello, Jan.
Where did Floyd Bjornstern Olson come from?
Must have been a farm in southern Minnesota.
No, he was an urban young man who grew up in the north side of Minneapolis, in the teeming Jewish community of North Minneapolis, Norwegian and Swedish background, but grew up really in the bosom of the Jewish working class.
How'd that shape him?
It shaped him tremendously. It gave him insights into the problems of working class life. It gave him insights into the life of adjustment of a second generation or an immigrant generation. It gave him long-lasting friendships with the people from that community, and in fact he brought them into government with him, making a tremendous impact in the first time bringing Jewish people into state government.
You know, one of our index file questions a long time ago had to do with how many languages he knew, and they were to name each of them.
Yes.
And where many people were stumped, I bet you can guess
was on Yiddish.
That's
of
right.
Course,
He,
yes.
he learned
In
Yiddish.
fact, he knew Yiddish probably better than he knew Norwegian and Swedish.
That is fascinating. Now, he was our first farmer labor governor.
Exactly.
Correct?
Absolutely.
And how much did he have to do with bringing about the Farmer Labor Party?
Well, first of all, as far as the Farmer Labor Party is concerned, he was the first really major statewide success of the Farmer Labor Party. In its initial years, in the early 20s, it elected a number of congressmen and U.S. senators. But he was the first statewide governor elected, and at the time he was elected, it was the time of the Great Depression. It was a major breakthrough in Minnesota politics, in the sense that the whole structure of Minnesota politics underwent a tremendous transformation, a change. For the first time, second-generation working-class farmers were brought into the mainstream of political decision-making.
Well, now, Hi, as a matter of fact, we happen to have a clip where we are going to see the governor, and we're going to get a chance to hear his speaking style.
The Farmer Labor Party does not wish to confiscate the property of anyone. What we want is to create an economic system, so that we can produce enough wealth to satisfy the needs of all the people. We want every man, woman, and child in the United States to have enough to eat. We want every man, woman, and child to have a decent home to live in, and decent clothing to wear, and an opportunity for decent recreation.
I tell you, he could win today.
Oh,
couldn't
yes,
he?
but remember that at the time he was making that speech, this was the time when over 50% of Minnesotans were without work, when all the farmers were losing their farms, when in fact it was difficult to get food on the table. And here he was explaining that he was not for confiscation of property, but for redistribution.
That's a radical concept, or
That's a radical concept in the sense that before Floyd Olson, there was, of course, the laissez-faire attitudes of free marketplace economics completely prevalent in the state and the nation. Mm-hmm. And he was, in fact, saying, hold on a moment, let's have some state intervention, federal and state intervention, to serve the needs not of the fat cats, not of the rich people, but of the ordinary American, the ordinary Minnesotan. And that was a major change. He was in Minnesota what Franklin Roosevelt was for the nation. In other words, a kind of transformational individual in bringing some reform ideals into the government. The alternative was, of course, real radicalism, real transformation of the society, perhaps into a socialist or even a fascist direction.
Now, during this period of time, agriculture, of course, was in horrible straits, and he took on a rather regional importance with respect to agricultural issues. Well, we have another clip there as well, where he is giving a speech, I think, before or with a series of governors from the Midwest.
The governors of 5 western states represent that part of the United States which is known as the breadbasket of the United States. And we're down here pleading the plight of agriculture. And all that we're asking for agriculture is equality. We're asking that the government fix prices so as to give the farmer a fair price for his commodity. And if government does that, as it has done in the case of oil, in the case of lumber, in the case of a great many industrial products, we, the Middle West and the Far West, will be able to buy a great many of the products that are made by industry and cannot now be sold because agriculture has no buying power. In other words, give us equality, restore our buying power, and you'll have prosperity in America.
This was, of course, Olson's response to the Farm Holiday Association. In effect, going down to Washington, leading a delegation of regional governors, saying to then Herbert Hoover, look, you got to do something. You got to do something for agriculture. Of course, Herbert Hoover wasn't listening. And when Franklin Roosevelt became president, in effect, the ideas that the Midwestern governors brought to Washington were, in fact, instituted in the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, and the beginning of subsidized agriculture, permanently subsidized agriculture in America.
By the way, we still have a few more things to cover, but I have to ask this. He was known as something of a ladies' man, wasn't he?
Absolutely.
He was very a compelling, sort of charismatic individual.
Very charismatic, and he was a womanizer. Certainly wouldn't get very far in this political climate with the women's movement.
But at that time, it was basically ignored?
Okay, I
it was
guess,
all right?
yeah.
And when he died, an incredible outpouring.
Incredible outpouring. He was, in fact, the most beloved governor of the 20th century. And, in fact, one can say he probably was the greatest governor of the 20th century. And I include in that my good friend Rudy Perpich. The fact remains that he probably could have been president of the United States.
Now, how would that have come about?
Very
Had he
simply,
lived?
in 36, he was running for the United States Senate. He would have been elected. No question about that. In 1940, when Roosevelt was looking for a running mate, he was looking for a Midwestern person to run for him. He took Henry Wallace. No question, he would have taken Floyd Olson. Floyd Olson would not have alienated the political bosses of the Democratic Party the way Henry Wallace did. Thus, 44, he would have been, again, running mate. 45, Roosevelt died.
There he was.
Floyd Olson.
His legacy. Let's spend the final moments.
His legacy was very, very important. In fact, the modern political system in Minnesota stems from his administration. The inclusion of the previously excluded individuals and groups in the society as part of the political process comes from him. The organization of the labor movement and his role in it is very important. The creation, in fact, of the kind of elimination of the elitism of the big business, banking, and corporate establishment, this, of course, stems from his administration. He still remains, I think, the charismatic governor the man whose name is probably best known by most Minnesotans of all the Minnesota governors, those who even didn't live through that time. He was a giant in his time and a giant in historical memory.
Hi, Berman. Thank you very, very much.
Never learned much more in any summer.
It's
This
wonderful.
has been great.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Well, it could be this year's biggest Minnesota news story, the Sunday night Northwest airliner crash near Detroit. Just the kind of fast-moving, complex story that puts local news media to the test. The plane crashed about 8 p.m., forcing local stations to scramble to put together packages for their 10 o'clock newscasts.
Good evening. Joan has the night off. Topping tonight's News 11, a Northwest Airlines jet plane crashes in Detroit.
The plane taking off for Phoenix crashed into a...
Eyewitness News.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Mike Binkley. Angela Storr has the night off. Leading the Eyewitness News update tonight, a Northwest Airlines DC-9 carrying at least 146 people crashed this evening at Detroit's Metropolitan Airport. The airplane crashed shortly after takeoff.
Is the 10 p.m. report.
Good evening, everyone. A Northwest Airlines DC-9 crashed on takeoff tonight in Detroit.
Flight 255 had at least 100.
As the week progressed, the reporting became more sophisticated as stories about the potential cause of the crash dominated news time. So here to help us analyze this week's reporting is this week's version of the media panel. Karen Boris, former TV reporter for WCCO and CBS. Kathy Dalglish, also a former Twin Cities television reporter, now an instructor of journalism. And Tom Connery teaches journalism at the College of St. Thomas. Well, I'm sitting there watching 10 o'clock Sunday night. Tom, who won opening night? Did you have a chance to look at all three on opening night? Who won Sunday night?
I looked at all the tapes. I don't think you can call a winner. One of the things that struck me about the coverage all week long was how different it was, no matter who you were watching. And it sort of was proving a point that some journalists refuse to admit, and that is that they are indeed telling stories, not making fiction up, but each time they write a story or present something for broadcasting, each one is its own version of reality, and each one was coming up with some different information. They all had the basic facts. You know, there was a crash and some people were dead, but after that, it depended on how they played it. And as the week progressed, it got to be even more interesting how you got different versions.
I thought 11 kind of got out of the chute pretty good, though.
They did real well Sunday night, I think, going live to Detroit and picking up that Detroit station. They fumbled a couple times, they lost the signal, but they gave us as much information as they could. And I think, especially as we sit here and try to armchair quarterback a breaking news story, I think it's important to realize they have to give us, news agencies have to give us their best truth as fast as they can. And
this is Sunday night when you don't have a full staff.
When you don't have a full staff and you've only got 2 hours to airtime. I think it was very, I also agree with Kathy that 11 won the first night and then kind of dropped the ball as the week went on. But NBC and ABC apparently both made the local affiliates broadcast available to other stations throughout the country. CBS did not. CBS was feeding a lot of pictures, but they were not picking up their local affiliates. But I think Channel 11 here picked up a lot more of the Detroit broadcast than Channel 5 did, and I think that was definitely points in their favor.
Well, we've asked the panelists to come up with kind of the best and worst moments they saw during the week of coverage. And Tom, let's start with you. Kind of quickly set up what you got here.
Okay. For the most part, the coverage wasn't exceptional, either positive or negatively. It was generally, the reporting was from fair to very good. But there were some instances, I think, where news media, both print and broadcast, tried to point a finger. They really were anxious to say what the cause was. And that led to some, I think, misleading stories, sometimes contradictory stories. I noticed in the Star and Tribune, and we're going to see it on this tape from KARE Channel 11, where we have a statement at the top of the story saying that the engine perhaps was the cause, and then later on in the story they have an official that contradicts what they let in with.
Let's take a look at this. Is Professor Connery's version of his bad clip from Channel 11.
There's word tonight a bad engine aboard that DC-9 may have caused the crash in Detroit.
Dr. John Lauber of the National Transportation Board said after today's preliminary investigation, they are ruling nothing out. But it appears sabotage is not an issue, and the left engine that has been speculated about so much in the last 24 hours didn't show an obvious problem.
And at this point, there is no evidence that we have found of an uncontained failure in the left engine, nor is there any evidence that's been found of an in-flight fire.
Lee didn't fit with the rest of the story.
Karen, are you under pressure to reach a conclusion right away as a reporter on a major story like this?
Not on a major. I think if you reach a conclusion like on a story like this, you're going to find yourself pretty wrong. At this point, your real obligation is to let everybody know that all of the options are on the table, that nobody has going in one direction or another. One of the, you know, I said earlier that Channel 11 won the first night and then dropped the ball, and that's what we just saw. The other two stations were going live with reporters live in front of a camera in Detroit. This gives a reporter more time to work on their story. It gives them more time to put, you know, the important elements into it. Channel 11 had had a reporter in Phoenix and a reporter in Detroit, but they were shipping back their stories, probably by satellite. Well, I'm sure by satellite. But they themselves were not in front of the camera, not available for Q&A with their anchors.
Okay, Kathy, you're next, and you've got the wrong angle taken on the story. Is that your?
What I put this was in a list of peculiar stories, I think, probably, or odd angles. In this story, which was on KSTP on Monday night, we get sort of the stock market business approach to tragedy, and we learn that the big picture is the money picture, and that financial disaster does not necessarily follow airline disaster. It's an odd angle to take the night after this kind of a crash.
Take a look at it. This is Pat Milan from KSTP Channel 5.
And analysts say the airline is unlikely to lose any money because of the crash. In fact, past crashes have ended up, unbelievably, as a financial gain. A big part of the reason for that is due to planes being insured far beyond their value on the company books.
There have been cases, certainly, where, in fact, depending on the insurance values of the equipment, that it turns out to be a gain rather than a financial loss.
No one is suggesting that financial gains could ever make up for the loss of human lives. But in the hard and cold world of business, a major airline crash is not considered a financial disaster.
Well, it's not a teddy bear for Cecilia Sheehan, but at the same time, doesn't it have some merit, though? I mean, isn't that something that's kind of, I didn't know that.
I think maybe the timing is bad. What we're saying is it's a little tacky to run this story the night after that kind of a disaster. And they followed it up the following night with another sort of business angle, how-to story. Where can you best sue an airline if your loved one is killed in a crash? And so you have to put those stories in a list of either tacky or odd angles.
Okay.
Well, another one that we looked at, on Tuesday, the reporters were allowed, and the photographers were allowed on the crash site for the first time. And this is the kind of story that has the potential of really being sensitive and nice, or just being gaudy and awful. We had both versions, and I have to say, Alan Cox is a friend of mine, and I didn't choose this story. The other two chose this as perhaps the best story that we saw during the week. This is Alan Cox at the crash site on Tuesday.
Okay, this is Alan Cox from Channel 4 on the scene near Detroit, near Romulus, Michigan.
This morning we saw what we'd waited to see up close for a day and a half and still were shocked to see. Even with the bodies of the victims removed, it was an overwhelmingly sad scene. It was clear, as Deputy Sheriff put it, the final moments of Flight 255 were like firing a rocket through a tunnel. The jet shot beneath two underpasses. It overran at least 3 cars on the roadway below. What struck me was how little of it was recognizable as an aircraft. Engines scattered, a few seats, parts of the window, a part of the fuselage with a fragment of the name Northwest now resting where it should never be.
Tom, you got to admire the writing there. I thought it was very nice.
Indeed, the writing was very nice, and I think that's what struck me the most about this piece by Alan Cox, was that it was one of the few times in the disaster coverage that we had the words and the pictures going together, and it wasn't, the words were not cliche. They weren't the usual typical tragedy. There was a feeling I had from listening to Alan that he really was overwhelmed by this sad scene, and you could feel that as you went along, and it all worked together.
Well, and then on contrast, on Channel 11 that night, they had their reporter was also at the scene, and they supered grim scene over the pictures, which to me, you know, sometimes those things work and sometimes they don't. This was a good case of it not working. I mean, it was insulting. It was so abrasive at this sensitive moment to be, you know, grim scene to be put over the top.
No need for that, too, with Alan's tone of voice. I think
Sure.
the power of the medium really came through. The tone of his voice let us know.
I'm anxious to know what you thought about how the carrier handled it, how Northwest Airlines carried it. And we have this segment for you because earlier today we spoke with Red Tyler, head of public relations for Northwest Airlines, and we asked him to rate the local television coverage of the crash.
I think the media have done a reasonably good job. It must be recognized that you have a ratings war going on between channels 11 and 4. That has made Channel 11 more overzealous in all of their reports on aviation, particularly us. It has made Channel 4 more aggressive and has caused them to be, of course, very critical of us because we don't jump every time they want a media interview.
Now, does that serve Red Tyler and Northwest well when the company, you know, says it doesn't jump? Was it in their interest to be jumping more and to be more accessible, or did they do the right thing public relations-wise?
They don't jump for the media. They jump for the people who read the media or view the media or listen to the media. And I think by not coming forward and talking, this was a time where they could have scored big points by being compassionate and being seen by the public in the Twin Cities as being compassionate and concerned, which I'm certain they are. But instead, they hid, and to me, that was arrogant.
This is not a new sort of modus operandi for Northwest either. The general way that they behave is to send out a written statement, which may be fine for print, but does not work for television or the broadcast medium at all. You need an interview, and it just isn't forthcoming from Northwest.
Well, what about you said, you know, maybe they hid from the television camera, but there were a number of stories this week in the two newspapers which talked about their compassionate generosity to the families of the victims of the crash, and even their defense for why they refused to list the roster of names, because they really didn't want the ghouls of the world, including television cameras, to be camped out on the families' homes. So how did you think they came across, at least in the print media?
I don't think that Northwest has, I think Red Tyler's right in that sense. Northwest does not have an obligation, for example, to release the names. But I do think it is in Northwest's interest to demonstrate a little more cooperation with the media, that they are being open and frank. And I think that in this case, it seemed almost like they were battling the media rather than cooperating. Although, as you say, when you read the newspapers, there's lots from Red Tyler and Bob Gibbons and a guy named Whalen there, and all these folks are being quoted left and right, but it's all telephone interviews and pretty much on Northwest terms.
Give me 15 seconds on CARE being #1 at 10 o'clock.
15 seconds. I certainly surprised a lot of people where I used to work.
That was a Channel 4. Well, this was very interesting, and we're going to do this again with a media configuration, see how the stations and the papers cover the big story of the week. Very interesting. Thanks for being here tonight. It's good.
Soul of tonight's program, the index file questions. Let's jump right in with last week's effort. Now, we told you to listen closely because it was going to haunt you till you got the right answer. The question had to do with a well-known celebrity who grew up in our state. Now, that was not the odd part. What was unusual is that this person was born, according to current biography, in 1912 with a name bearing an uncanny similarity to a noted Minneapolis landmark. We admitted that the question doesn't make any sense, but swore to you that we were on the level. What well-known celebrity from Minnesota was born with a name very similar to that of a prominent Minneapolis landmark? Now, we asked you to give us this person's real name and the name by which we know him or her, As usual, we first get to hear the embarrassing incorrect answers.
Judy Garland was born Frances Gump, and that sounds like the hump of Minneapolis Metrodome.
Minnie Pearl, whose name is closely associated with the Minnehaha Falls.
Buffalo Bill made his last appearance in Minneapolis in 1912. I hope I'm right.
The Minnesota-born celebrity is Sid Hartman. The landmark is the IDS Tower. If you unscramble IDS, it spells Sid.
But not all of you were misdirected. Among correct guessers was Raoul from Edina.
This is the first index file answer which I think I have known. The answer to your question is Harriet Lake, and she has been known ever since as Ann Southern.
Absolutely correct. Ann Southern, movie actress and later a television star, was the person we were looking for. And contrary to what some callers thought, Ann was not born near and therefore named after Lake Harriet. Ann was actually born in Valley City, North Dakota, and she didn't move to Minneapolis until later. Oh, well, let's move on to this week's question. Now, it has to do with a noted American from an earlier era. This famous American arrived in St. Paul on May 26, 1861. This noted visitor came to Minnesota in search of improved health. The quest, however, was in vain. After spending about a month recuperating in the Minnesota wilderness, this person returned home back east. Now, this famous person died shortly thereafter. So what's our question? Who is this mysterious, health-seeking 1861 St. Paul visitor? Think you know the answer? Give our answering machines a jingle. Even if you are vacationing at a cabin by a northern pond, call us anyway. The number to dial is 642-1980. That's 642-1980. And as always, we want to hear other thoughts you may have about our program. Now, last week, many of you, believe it or not, called in with complaints about what Eric had to say on the 10th anniversary of the death of Elvis Presley. It seems that Eric's comments had a number of you all shook up.
I am definitely not an Elvis Presley fan. I've never seen a movie. I don't listen to his songs, but I think his remarks about Elvis were very, very tasteless.
Elvis Presley.
I like the Almanac program very much. In fact, when I discovered it was on Sunday morning, I changed my time of going to church in order to get there and still be able to hear your program. However, this Sunday, I considered Eric's comments on Elvis Presley to be absolutely offensive, in bad taste, and a little revolting.
Are you lonesome tonight? Oh, call our answering machines at 642-1980. One final note tonight. Next Tuesday and Wednesday, KTCA will present a special two-part edition of Almanac Extra. The topic will be children's television. On Tuesday night at 7, we will look at the demise of local kids' TV right here in Minnesota. Then on Wednesday night at 7, we will broaden our focus by looking at how new American cartoons are now invading Great Britain. It'll feature a satellite discussion between a group of American producers here in the Almanac studio and a group of very angry parents in London. It promises to be 2 very interesting hours of television. That's Almanac Extra, next Tuesday and Wednesday nights right here on KTCA. Check your listings for airtimes on other Minnesota public television stations. Well, that is it for now. Until next week, for Eric Leslie Escala, this is Jan Ingrid Smaby. Good night.
Tomorrow, hear the sound of American music. Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein define the modern American musical. Now remember their greatest songs in a star-studded salute to the musical magic. Rodgers and Hammerstein, the sound of American music. Part of a Pledge-Free August, tomorrow night at 8:40. Funding for Almanac is provided in part by Larkin, Hoffman, Daly, and Lindgren Limited, attorneys at law, serving clients in a rapidly changing legal environment. Norstan Incorporated, a distributor for telecommunications equipment products including IBM Rome. Minnesota's credit unions, people helping people. And Gabbard's Furniture and Design Studio of Edina. You'll find your home at Gabbard's. Almanac is a production of KTCA TV for stations of the Minnesota Public Television Association.
Hi, I'm Peter Moore, and this is a postcard we received recently at Channel 2. If no on-air pledging, the sender asks, what happens to all the specials that are a part of Pledge Week? Will they be shown? Signed, a viewer from Mound. Well, the answer is all of our specials will be shown in their entirety and uninterrupted. That's because so many of you are supporting a campaign for a pledge-free August. In fact, we've knocked off 8 of our pledge nights, leaving only 2 to go. This August on KTCA, you can have your cake and eat it too. No pledging, yet all the pledge specials. By the way, to that viewer from Mound, your check must have fallen out of the postcard. Doesn't seem to be here. Rush your check now to Countdown, Channel 2, St. Paul 55108. And if you received a letter from us, there's no better time than right now to respond and help us reach our goal of a pledge-free August.
Presentation of tonight's broadcast schedule is brought to you in part by Moss & Barnett, a professional association, attorneys at law, located in downtown Minneapolis. Taylor McCaskill is now the St. Paul office of